Between January and June 1919, the Allied leaders met in Paris to draft peace terms. The major figures were known as the Big Four, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy, respectively Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando. Prince Seonji of Japan was also invited to discuss Asian issues. This invitation was the first formal recognition that Japan had received of its new great power status. These figures recognized that they could not just impose their will on Germany, which gave them a complicated agenda. They needed to create a new international order to replace the four empires that had fallen in the conflict. H.G. Wells, in the Daily News of August 14, 1914, had called the war to end all wars, to justify British participation. Now, the victors needed to craft a peace so that it would be the end to war, just like H.G. Wells had mentioned. At the same time, the demands of justice could be hard to locate after 4 years of wartime emotions and propaganda. 3 sets of pragmatic considerations needed to be weighed in the treaty process. First, the Allies had signed treaties and made agreements before and during the course of the war. Secondly, the strategic and economic interests of the major victorious powers needed to be considered. Thirdly, there was a need to contain the revolutionary regimes that had begun in Russia but were now spreading west as far as Central Europe. In the end, the idealistic language of peace aims clashed with strategic interests and the realities of deal-making. The war had begun as a quarrel over national interests, but it ended as a crusade for freedom and national independence. With Russia as one of the core members of the Entente, democracy and nationalism had not been key to the outbreak of the war. Only after 1917 were these elements introduced. As the war progressed, propaganda had been introduced to persuade various populations to endure the long war. The Allies had highlighted German aggression and their atrocities in Belgium. Lloyd George himself had promised that the war would create, quote, a land fit for heroes, unquote. Germany, too, had promised major changes in its political system after a victorious war. The bargain that had been made was that in return for fighting through to victory, a better world would follow. The Bolshevik Revolution under Lenin had brought some of these war aims to the forefront. Lenin had urged the people of Europe to force their leaders to end the war, claiming that the war was being fought solely, quote, to decide which of the strong and healthy nations should dominate the weak ones, end quote. Leon Trotsky, the Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, had even published the secret wartime treaties that Russia had agreed to after he broke open the safes he found in the foreign ministry. Some of the tidbits from these documents were the fact that Russia had planned to annex Galicia from Austria and the Bosporus Straits from the Turks. France had, as everyone already knew, planned to retake Alsace-Lorraine, and Italy had been promised lands in the Alps and around the head of the Adriatic. Although ultimately to no avail, this effort by the Russians was to end the war by exposing to a war-weary public just how craven their governments were. The linchpin to Allied war aims, though, were Wilson's 14 points. Many took this speech to be nearly religious in importance. In Britain, a group of liberal war critics formed the Union of Democratic Control to argue a number of key points. They maintained that democracies based on national constituencies were more peaceful than autocracies. Also, diplomats who practiced openly were more likely to keep the peace, and the justification for most wars would be eliminated if self-determination were granted. To this end, this union fundamentally agreed with Wilson, believing him to be the prophet that would lead Europe into a new future. Wilson himself was thronged by crowds whenever he was in public. The Germans, too, looked to Wilson. After all, they had based their armistice on the principles of the 14 points. Unfortunately, the secret treaties that had been promised during the war could complicate the peace process. In the fall of 1914, when the war first entered a stalemate, the Allies solidified their pact by making secret promises to each other. Their chief fear was that Russia would make a separate peace and leave the war. As already mentioned, Russia was promised the Straits and even control over Constantinople. France was granted Alsace-Lorraine, while the British position in Egypt would be solidified. When Italy was brought into the war, lands were offered to them to sweeten the deal. Even Romania had been promised Transylvania. Now, that particular agreement had a clause that invalidated it if Romania made a separate peace, which Romania did when they surrendered to Germany. Significantly, these agreements threatened to amputate lands from the Central Powers, but not to destroy them. At the same time, promises were made to the minority peoples within multinational empires. These would contribute to the revolutionary promises inherent in nationalism. Ultimately, the Allies would support Polish, Czechoslovakian, and Yugoslavian independence. By 1919, though, these were not just promises, but the nationalities had already acted on them, essentially making them fait accomplis, or accomplished facts. Similarly, more vague promises have been made to the subjects of the Ottoman Empire. The British had wanted Arab assistance against the Turks. Guerrilla operations by Arab Bedouins had aided the Allied war effort. The British had led a particular Arab family, the Hashemites, to believe that they could count on British support for an Arab kingdom after the war. These promises, though, did not take the Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916 into consideration. This agreement allocated British and French spheres of influence in the Middle East, which were irreconcilable with all notions of Arab independence. The French were to be predominant in the northeast coast and inland, being the dominant force in Syria and Lebanon. The British would prevail along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is modern-day Iraq, and the Jordan, which would later become both Jordan and Israel. In November 1917, the Balfour Declaration was released, which looked with favor on a Jewish national home in Palestine. This declaration was to show support to Zionists at the time and later. Those groups that had received promises tried to cash them in at Paris. The Polish and Czechoslovak national committees were present, and they had already been recognized as the governments of their respective peoples. Prince Faisal, who was the head of the Hashemite family, arrived with T.E. Lawrence to lobby for an Arab kingdom. Chaim Weizmann, a Manchester chemist, urged the creation of a Zionist homeland for Israel. Just outside Paris, W.E.B. Du Bois organized the first Pan-African Congress. Even if the Allies had fully intended on fulfilling all of their promises, they would not have been able to do so. For example, it is impossible to draw a map of Poland that fulfilled both the promises that were made to it. First of all, to create a state with a majority of ethnic Poles, and secondly, to grant them access to the sea. There were also aforementioned contradictory promises made in the Middle East. The earlier secret treaties that were signed were done for dynastic interests, while the latter ones were done for either democratic or nationalist interests, and these clashed. The earlier treaties had brazenly shifted frontiers and traded territories, disregarding the ethnic identities and aspirations of their inhabitants. It was much easier to bargain land without the input of the inhabitants in 1915 than would prove to be the case in 1919. The three major Allied powers at the end of the war all wished for the peace to satisfy some of their strategic interests to one extent or another. The French, under Clemenceau, argued that France had borne the brunt of the Central Powers' attacks, and should therefore be the primary state in guaranteeing the enforcement of the post-war settlement. This entailed the fact that the peace terms should favor French security. The growing influence of France in 1919, though, was artificial. France had, after all, nearly collapsed in May of 1917 and again in July of 1918. Also, the French demographic crisis was creating a greater imbalance between France and their German rivals with every generation. There were only 40 million French people to the 60 million Germans. This shortfall had industrial consequences as well. Therefore, while the French may have seen the dominant power in 1919, this was only the result of the unprecedented simultaneous collapse of Russia and Germany, and could not be expected to last. Indeed, the French military thought that it would be expected to provide the bulk of troops necessary to enforce the treaty on both fronts. This included sending French soldiers to guarantee the freedom of the newly independent successor states in Eastern Europe. The French military were tempted by the possibility of turning their temporary military superiority into a permanent system of barriers on both Germany and Russia. Throughout the negotiating process, the French stubbornly held on to the necessity of firm guarantees of French security. Some radical French politicians wanted the Rhineland, which is the region of Germany west of the Rhine River, detached from Germany and made it into a neutral territory, thus making the Rhine River the formal frontier of Germany. Clemenceau himself opposed such a serious move, but was willing to raise the prospect as a negotiating point to gain the less significant concessions that he did want. The need for French security would be a major factor in determining which ethnic minorities would be favored in the post-war system. The British believed that the best peace for them would be a self-enforcing, non-punitive peace that would allow for a rapid economic revival after the conflict. John Maynard Keynes wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he stressed the importance of a healthy German economy for the benefit of all of Europe. The French accused the British of trying to balance Germany with France as future trade partners. The British and the Americans hardly opposed any prospect of detaching the Rhineland from Germany, but they did maintain an active role in the former German African colonies and the territories in the Middle East that had been stripped from the Ottoman Empire. Wilson also represented American interests, despite his claims to be seeking universal goals. Wilson was well aware of the large Polish-American community and their domestic concerns, and saw his advocacy of an independent Poland as a way to appeal to their support. Free trade, which was one of the 14 points, would also greatly help U.S. commerce. Wilson needed to work with the U.S. Senate, and the Senate demanded that he insert into the treaty statements that previous U.S. commitments superseded any new terms agreed in Paris, and that was a specific reference to the Monroe Doctrine. Another factor that played a role in the negotiating of the treaty was the desire to contain the spread of Bolshevism. Some Cold War historians saw the Paris peace treaties as the first step in containment. Although the armistice had demanded that the Germans remove their troops from the east, the Allies did not enforce this. In fact, German troops remained in Ukraine and the Russian portions of Poland until February of 1919. They also maintained possession of the railroad lines of the Baltic states until the summer of 1919 to keep that avenue of intervention open if needed. In addition, the first group of volunteer enlistees, known as the Free Corps, under General Rüdiger von der Goltz, were formed. 30,000 men volunteered to keep Eastern Europe free from Bolshevik influence, and served as unofficial allies of the Allies against the Soviets. These fears helped to explain some of the territorial changes that were made in Eastern Europe. These states were expected to be able to serve as a counterweight to both Germany and Russia. Poland was expanded beyond its ethnic frontiers in both the East and the West to help it serve as a counterweight. In 1921, the French helped them gain even more territory after the brief Russo-Polish War. Czechoslovakia was given lands in the east inhabited by Ruthenians, further complicating the national mix of that new state. Romania was also given additional lands, Bessarabia from Russia and Transylvania from Hungary. The people living here were ethnically related, but still mixed areas. The anti-Bolshevism of the Allies even led them, in an emergency, to disregard the democratic impulses of a national group. When the Bolshevik Bela Kun took power in Hungary, the Allies supported a Romanian invasion to expel him in August of 1919. The Allies also supported a Romanian invasion to oust the next Hungarian government, which, while moderately socialist, was chosen by the Hungarian people. Then the Allies made peace with the anti-democratic Hungarian military officers who then seized power. Each of the peace treaties signed to conclude the Paris Peace Conference was named after the Parisian palace closest to the signing ceremony. As a result, the most famous of these agreements became known as the Treaty of Versailles, because it was signed in the Hall of Mirrors of that palace on June 28, 1919. The treaty concluded with Austria on September 10th was called the Treaty of Saint-Germain, while the Treaty of Trianon was ultimately signed on June 4th, 1920, with Hungary, but only after the expulsion of the unacceptable Hungarian government of Bela Kun. The treaty ending the war with Bulgaria was signed on November 27, 1919, at Neuilly, while the last one was the Treaty of Sèvres on August 10, 1920, with Turkey. This last one was delayed because of the rise of Ataturk's Turkish nationalist movement that overthrew the Ottomans. The Allies needed to wait until the succeeding government was in place before concluding their agreement. At President Wilson's insistence, the first order of business was establishing the League of Nations. This was designed to be a permanent peacekeeping organization. The project was Wilson's particular goal, and to force the issue, he was willing to be the first sitting president to visit Europe while in office. There was a strong popular sentiment behind changing the basic ways of doing international relations. The principle of the League of Nations was agreed to on January 25th, and in the next several months were spent drafting the terms, finishing on April 28th. A General Assembly of all member states was to be formed. 42 states were invited, with later invitations sent to Germany in 1926 and the USSR in 1934. A governing council of the five great powers, and 4 others that were elected by the General Assembly, would chair the major business. Every member agreed to respect and preserve the territorial integrity of other members, namely the post-war boundaries. any disputes between members needed to be submitted to arbitration between the members. If the parties could not agree to the arbitration, they were still required to wait 3 months before declaring war. A premature war would force the other League members to take actions, which could be sanctions, a blockade, or military action, according to Article 16. The League itself, though, was not sovereign and had no military force of its own, and actions could not be taken without the unanimous consent of the governing council. The League also took control of the colonies and overseas territories of the defeated powers. They were not awarded to the victors, but turned into League of Nations mandates. This meant that they were under the tutelage of the League if they were not, according to Article 22, able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. End quote. This tutelage was to come from the advanced nations, who were supposed to provide an annual report to the League on the status of their mandates. The mandates were divided into 3 classes based on how close to independence they were. Class A mandates were former Ottoman lands whose newly liberated peoples were expected to reach independence. These were Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. Class B mandates were Germany's former African colonies. They were not expected to be able to gain independence in the foreseeable future and were to be essentially absorbed into the existing African empires. Tanganyika, which is present-day Tanzania, went to Britain, with the parts adjacent to the Congo granted to Belgium. Togo and Cameroon were divided between Britain and France. Class C mandates passed directly under the laws of the mandatory power. Southwest Africa was added to South Africa, where it would remain until gaining independence as Namibia in 1990. New Guinea was transferred to Australia, while the South Sea Islands went to Japan. The Class B and C mandates, despite the terminology, were essentially assimilated colonies. Only one of the Class A mandates attained full sovereignty before World War II, and that was Iraq in 1922. Article 8 of the League of Nations declared general disarmament, but this would be radically scaled down, as we'll see in a moment. The League also served as a clearinghouse for creating treaties between the League and member states who had large national or religious minorities. The Minorities Commission was designed to guarantee the protection of minority nationalities against discrimination. The original members were Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and Romania. Albania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria, and Iraq would all later be encouraged to join in order to facilitate their entrance into the League of Nations. The League established the International Labour Office to report on work and wage conditions in member states. Other specialized agencies were set up to deal with medical, humanitarian, and legal matters. Considering their secondary nature, it's interesting to note that these are perhaps the longest-lasting legacy of the League. Only 2 of the 14 points dealt directly with Western Europe. The first was Point 7, which declared that Belgium needed to be evacuated and restored, and the second was Point 8, which stated that French territory needed to be freed and restored, and that the wrong done to France in 1871 was to be undone. This is an oblique reference to Alsace-Lorraine. Despite these limited claims, other pragmatic concerns complicated the simplicity of Wilson's speech. One of these concerns was the Rhineland. Early on, the French showed their willingness to use their army to shape the direction of the peace. Under the terms of the armistice, the Allies were allowed to advance to the Rhine and occupy 3 bridgeheads across the river at Mainz, Koblenz, and Cologne. The territory adjacent on the right bank of the river was to be a neutral zone. As previously mentioned, some within France began to work to detach the Rhineland completely from Germany, but this was done without official authorization. Some Germans cooperated with this initiative. Hans Adam Dorten, the former district attorney of Dusseldorf and the spokesman for the Dusseldorf Industrialist Club, prepared the Rhineland Constituent Assembly in February of 1919. The idea was to spare the Rhineland from the harsh terms that would be given to the rest of Germany. They preferred to establish ties with France than with the socialists who were running Berlin or the Bolsheviks who had seized Bavaria. Many Rhineland residents were Catholics who resented Prussian dominance of Germany. One of these figures was Konrad Adenauer, the young Catholic mayor of Cologne, but later he had become the first chancellor of West Germany after the Second World War. Marshal Foch lobbied the Paris Peace Conference for this separate Rhineland against Clemenceau's express wishes. Lloyd George and Wilson, though, also opposed such a move, officially because they did not want to sign off on a settlement that would lead to future causes for revenge. They very well may have had Alsace-Lorraine from 1871 on their minds. The actual territorial changes in the West were limited. Alsace-Lorraine, as expected, was returned wholly to France. Several border communities, Eupen, Malmedy, and Moresnet, were transferred to Belgium. Areas that Germany had seized from Denmark back in 1864 were allowed to hold plebiscites to determine their future. These split the territory, with the southern region remaining Germany, but the northern region voting to return to Denmark. The Saar coal mines, just north of Lorraine, were to remain German, but would be placed under French possession for the next 15 years as, quote, compensation for the destruction of coal mines in the north of France, unquote. Once the 15 years were up in 1935, they were allowed to vote on their future national status, and they voted overwhelmingly to remain German. Ultimately, the Rhine then was not detached from Germany, but a barrier between Germany and France was still established. The Rhine then was demilitarized, as was a 50-kilometer-wide strip of territory east of the Rhine River. The idea was that this would hinder a German westward attack, while also easing French movements to assist an eastern ally. The west bank of the Rhine River would be occupied by the Allies for 15 years, with each of the three major allies taking possession of one of the crossings. The Americans occupied Koblenz, but handed over the French in January of 1923 after only 4 years. The British remained at Cologne only a few years longer, evacuating in December of 1925. The French remained the longest, staying in Mainz until June of 1930. This was still 5 years early, but was in accordance with the recently negotiated Young Plan. The US and Britain both signed treaties with France, guaranteeing the latter against attack from Germany. Germany was also substantially disarmed. The general staff was dissolved, and the army was limited to a volunteer force of 100,000 men. All volunteers were forced to sign up to 12-year service agreements to prevent the Germans from creating a large reserve of short-term recruits. The German Air Force was eliminated and the Navy greatly limited. The Germans were only allowed to sail 6 battleships over 10,000 tons, with 6 further light cruisers and 12 destroyers. They were not permitted submarines, heavy artillery, tanks, or poison gas. Even more onerous, the Germans were expected to pay for the cost of the war. It was a long practice among victors to extract fines and booty from the vanquished. In 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France was forced to pay an indemnity of 700 million francs. That was half of their entire peacetime budget, and it took the French 5 years to pay that. In 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had demanded 5 billion francs, which took the French 4 years to pay. In 1919, though, the reparations were larger, and the language used to justify them was in terms of moral recrimination. Article 231 states that as a result of the aggression of Germany and her allies, the reparations must be paid. In Article 232, Germany must, quote, make compensation for all damage done to the civilian populace of the Allied and associated powers and to their property, end quote. These demands grew over the course of the war and its immediate aftermath. In the 14 points, Wilson just spoke about restoring areas that had been conquered. Lloyd George, when running for re-election in December of 1918, had promised the electorate that Germany would pay the costs of war and reconstruction. French newspapers had also proclaimed that Germany would pay. None of the victorious powers had fully funded the war through taxes, and all had borrowed to some extent. Many had put in additional currency to cover their wartime deficits, leading to inflation. Bondholders needed to be paid, for defaulting would make future borrowing difficult. Additional money was needed to repair war-damaged buildings, bridges, railroads, mines, and farmland. No government could tax their populations heavily enough to pay these costs. The Allies had also offered loans to each other during the war, mostly funded by the US. While the Americans urged moderation in setting reparations, they also did not participate in the Reparations Commission and refused to consider waiving the Allies' debts. The members of the peace conference had difficulty in finding a reparations figure low enough for the Germans, but high enough for the French. As a result, a separate reparations commission was created to sort through these issues. The members were Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, and Serbia, and they met 7 times at various resorts to set the figure. A preliminary figure of 1 billion marks was set that the Germans would have to begin to pay immediately. The Germans were also expected to deliver coal to France to compensate for the French mines that the Germans had flooded during their retreat. In April 1921, the Commission set the total at 132 billion gold marks. This was $33 billion at the time, and over twice the 1914 German national income. The reparation was set at yearly installments of 2 billion marks, plus 26% of the value of German exports that year. Eventually, between 1919 and 1922, Germany would pay 13 billion of these reparations. The Germans didn't think that any government could make such payments, while the French responded that they could not survive while failing to collect them. In March of 1921, accusing the Germans of falling behind in their deliveries, French troops occupied 3 cities in the Ruhr area: Düsseldorf, Ruhrort, and Duisburg. The reparations payments needed to be converted to foreign currencies, whether francs or pounds, before being delivered. The Germans planned to increase their exports to help pay these costs, but were hampered by the Allies' distaste for buying German goods. As an alternative, the Germans offered to pay the reparations in kind with products. Walter Rathenau, the war munitions expert, had delivered this agreement in 1922, but he was shortly thereafter assassinated by German nationalists for this concession. All the while, the German mark was declining in value, not just because of reparations, but also because of wartime deficit spending issues, easy credit, and currency speculation. The map of Eastern Europe was entirely redrawn. In many ways, the thinking behind these changes resembled the Congress of Vienna, but this time the number of states was multiplied rather than reduced. The eastern border of Germany was pushed back hundreds of miles, surrendering Silesia and eastern Prussia. The Russian border remained that which they had agreed to in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, leaving it far to the east of 1914. The Allies were willing to accept the consequence of this agreement to hurt the Bolsheviks. Austria-Hungary was dissolved. Out of the remains of Austria-Hungary, and in the gap now generated between Germany and Russia, 8 new states arose. These were Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. In the Balkans, Romania grew, gaining land from Russia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Serbia too greatly expanded, becoming the new kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. In 1929, it would change its name to Yugoslavia. These changes were supposedly made based on the principles of self-determination, but the practice couldn't always be made to fit the principle. National interest, prior commitments, fait accompli, and the attempt to hold back Bolshevism all forced revisions to pure national determination. Also complicating the map was the fact that there were no neat ethnic frontiers. National consciousness in Eastern Europe had developed in the 19th century around folk languages and religions, not within existing state frontiers or economic relationships. As a result, points 9 and 11 of the 14 points didn't really apply. These were creating states along, quote, clearly recognizable lines of nationality, end quote, and, quote, historically established lines of allegiance and nationality, end quote. An example of these problems is Teschen, a small mining area claimed by both Poland and Czechoslovakia. Although not in Bohemia, which joined Czechoslovakia, it had been ruled for the previous 500 years by the King of Bohemia, and therefore certainly qualified under point 11 as being historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. However, the 1910 census revealed that 56% of the residents spoke Polish, while only 26% spoke Czech. 18% actually spoke German, but this argument for clear lines of nationality argued for Poland. Further complicating things, the area was economically linked to the banks and markets of Vienna. Politics divided the city, which was fought over in 1919 and 1920. It would become a part of Czechoslovakia until seized by Poland in 1938 and then ramped to World War II. Most of the cities and commercial and industrial centers had developed under German influence. In the countryside, however, local ethnic groups prevailed. In Silesia, industry had developed only after the German seizure, and the urbanites had assimilated German culture as miners and workers. The peasantry, however, remained thoroughly Polish. What then was Silesia's national identity in 1919, German or Polish? Danzig was a German port city handed over to Poland to give Poland access to the sea, but remained German in characteristics. Thus, while creating a separate state for each nationality seemed appealing from a distance, it was difficult to accomplish in reality. The way that borders were addressed were largely a result of pre-existing nationalist consciousness plus their participation in the war. The Poles and Czechs had developed a nationalist understanding in the 19th century and had won strong acceptance of their claims from the West. The Croats and Slovaks had been developing as national groups in the period, while the Slovenes were still in the process. Also important is the fact that Poles, Czechs, and Serbs had fought for the Allies in the war. Romania had too, but had signed a separate peace with the Germans, which might have forfeited such an advantage. On the other hand, the Austrians and Hungarians had fought against the Allies, and so had Bulgaria. The Hungarians had even formed a Soviet in May of 1919. The French were the most actively interested in Eastern Europe, and discriminated between these groups accordingly. Their primary purpose was to develop allies against Germany in the east and Russia in the west, now that their old alliance with Russia was dead. The French then desired a strong Poland, a strong Czechoslovakia, a strong Yugoslavia, and a strong Romania. They were willing to strengthen these states' claims, even at the expense of other equally valid national claims. Another component of the post-war settlement were decisions that were already accomplished. This became known as claim jumping. As the war drew to a close, several national groups wished to develop governments and militarily occupy areas that they wished to claim at the end of the war. In many cases, these direct actions preempted treaty decisions. In October of 1918, the South Slavs and the Czechs had already formed preparatory governments, and by January, the latter were fighting the Poles for Teschen. The Romanians had also claim jumped by seizing Bessarabia from Russia in 1918 and then Transylvania from Hungary in 1919. Now, as previously mentioned, the French supported stronger Eastern European states, a position that was ultimately supported by the British when Lloyd George was able to convince the French to allow certain areas plebiscites to settle their national fates. As mentioned a few minutes ago, the only reason that such wide adjustments in the Eastern European map were possible was because of the temporary collapse of both Germany and Russia. For these new states to survive, they needed to have outside support to help prop them up. Britain and the US were unwilling to make such lasting commitments, leaving France the only country to do so. The settlements left a number of lasting grievances, especially between states that got what they wanted and those that hadn't. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia were satisfied with the treaties, but Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria were not. The Slovaks and Croats were also upset about their minority positions within their new states. Each of these groups would look to outsiders in later years to try to redress their grievances. The Austrians would look to Germany, the Bulgarians to Russia, while Hungary would later on appeal to Hitler and Mussolini. These states also ended up with huge minority populations. Poland had 7.5 million Germans within its borders, especially in Danzig and Silesia. Nearly a quarter of the Czechoslovakian population were minority peoples. The old Austria-Hungary had created a single economic, trading, and financial unit, and now there were 7 of these. Each had its own frontiers, customs inspectors, and commercial regulations. Each of these new states had to recreate and renegotiate its supply and trade routes. In good economic times, this could have been overcome. But with the coming of the Great Depression, disaster loomed, and many even began to look fondly upon the old empire. President Wilson had assumed that granting self-determination would create a world of democracy and peace. In a region deeply divided by ethnicity and class, though, this would not be the result. The only of the succession states in the East that had an industrial economy was Czechoslovakia, and that further limited the economic horizons of the other countries there. Applying the peace settlement was not a simple undertaking. It was not self-enforcing, but required the Allies to put its clauses into effect. The Germans only accepted the treaty under protest, and the Allies maintained their economic blockade with the threat of invasion until it was applied. Fighting in Eastern Europe had erupted over some of the borders that we just discussed. There was fighting over Teschen, the Austrians and Hungarians clashed over their border, Italian nationalists also attempted to annex Fiume, and the Turks were busy creating their own new nation-state. The partial application and establishment of the peace settlements was a necessary outcome of the conflicted way in which the Allies had agreed to it in the first place. The U.S. Senate even failed to formally ratify the treaty, and Wilson's last year in office proved a disaster. His successor, Harding, returned the United States to isolationism. The British had a strongly nationalist election in 1918, but that sentiment of the party in power quickly changed, and Britain also quickly turned isolationist. France was left ideologically and now politically and militarily isolated. The November 1919 election was very conservative, with a great number of veterans winning office in France. As such, the French government initially supported the vigilant enforcement of the treaty. The new Prime Minister, Raymond Poincaré, ran a nationalist government, but this too would come to an end in 1924 when he lost his position. For the next 5 years, France changed direction and sought a degree of accommodation with Germany, until 1929 that is, when the world would again change rather dramatically.